Okay.
Welcome to the author interviews for Liberty Matters, a bi-monthly forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, Senior Fellow at the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by Jeremy Jennings, who has written one of the review essays for our August 2020 forum on J.S. Mill and life writing. If you'd like to watch our first interview with Ruth Skur, author of the lead essay, or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. Jeremy Jennings is Professor of Political Theory in the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford and has previously taught at the University of Swansea and the University of Birmingham and Queen Mary University in London. He has served as head of department at Birmingham and Queen Mary, and he has held various positions in France, including the Vincent Wright Professor at the Fondation Nationale de Sciences Politiques. Forgive the Spanish accent, Jeremy. Jeremy holds a visiting professorship at the Fondation Nationale de Sciences Politiques. He's written numerous books and articles on French political thought and was the founding editor of the European Journal of Political Theory. Jeremy, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today for the author interview at Liberty Matters. Welcome.
It's a great pleasure to join you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Jeremy, I wanted to start off by turning our viewers' attention to one of the first things you mentioned in your response essay. You mentioned that you first encountered and read Mill's autobiography as an undergraduate upon the recommendation from one of your professors, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
You also indicated that the book really was a powerful experience for you reading it. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what drew you into that book and why it had such an impact on you and your future academic career?
Well, thank you very much indeed. I was introduced to this by a man called W.H. Greenleaf, Jack Greenleaf, as he was known. And it was a complete chance, really. Jack Greenleaf was actually the first person to write a monograph about Oakeshott. And so I just suddenly found myself, aged 18, being taught by this really quite remarkable and somewhat eccentric individual. And he was really interested in he wrote about 3 or 4 volumes called The British Political Tradition. And he was really interested in the whole issue of the rise of the state in Britain. And he saw it as he set up this book as a sort of tension between libertarianism and collectivism. And he ran those things through the development of the British state, looking at institutions, also looking at political theory, political thought. And if you're interested in that, then Mill is the central figure, I think, because Mill, as we know, in a sense, is the history of British 19th century liberalism in one person, because he spans, in a sense, the beginning as a utilitarian and ends up as more or less endorsing socialism. He moves to a sort of welfare liberalism. Yeah. So Greenleaf thought that Mill, if you'd really to understand this development, Mill was a sort of central figure. And so there I was, aged 18, suddenly thrust into reading Bentham and other people like Hobhouse and so on, but Mill clearly was central to this. And I suppose, explains why I later became a professor. I can't quite believe that all my fellow 18-year-olds spent their Saturday reading the autobiography from cover to cover, but I certainly did. And I just think it is just a quite remarkable book. I know people say it was a boring book and so on, it's just about the things he read, but boy, did he read some stuff. And I just think it's a very, very powerful book about, the life of a particular, very strange mind, but the life of a mind, which spanned the 19th century. And I also think it's brutally honest. I think it really is, and that's why I think, and the point I wanted to make in my text was, this wasn't a boring book. I mean, it's a painful book to read, because this poor boy is manufactured by his father and Jeremy Bentham, and is scarred for life, really, and somehow or other has to try and resurrect himself, rebuild himself as best he can in the subsequent years. And we all know, that Mill's was all that I feel deeply ambivalent about a lot of things which Mill wrote. You cannot deny Mill's achievement. It is an astonishing achievement over life. Everyone knows On Liberty think of the principles of political economy, think of the book on the subjection of women, etc., 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 etc. He wrote about everything. The essays, I think the essays that he wrote on Coleridge, on Bentham, Spirit of the Times, his other, and his long correspondence, long essay on Tocqueville's Democracy in America. All of these things, I think, are gigantic achievements. And in some respects, I think the autobiography is the sort of the key through which you can see all of these other bits to this really astonishing intellectual, a formidable intellectual career.
Do you think it's better for someone to begin understanding Mill through the autobiography, or to read Mill and then try to understand him afterwards by encountering the autobiography?
I think that probably depends on the individual. Some people, I'm sure, would prefer just to go straight to something like On Liberty. Personally, my favorite book by the book I most like by Mill is The Principles of Political Economy, which, and with all its editions, with all its subsequent editions, which take you more and more away from the principle of laissez-faire towards state intervention. And I think that is a truly astonishing book. But I probably wouldn't want to start there.
No,
I actually think I would start with some of the essays, like the essays on Bentham and Coleridge and things like that, which I think are remarkable essays, which he wrote in that period when he's trying to refashion himself. And then, of course, you've got On Liberty. But certainly I think the problem with getting started with the autobiography, if you actually don't know anything about him, the reference points might lose you a little bit, if you know what I mean. But it's certainly well worth reading, I think.
So your point about as you said, the words you used, I believe, were tortured, for the difficult life that he led, particularly as a child. Yes. You know, it's interesting because, of course, many of us are intrigued by, well, particularly at Liberty Fund, we're intrigued and animated by self-education and continuing self-education. And it's pretty clear that Mill took the example of his education as a child and continued it throughout his life. And that's mentioned in the autobiography, the various projects that he engaged in, learning languages, writing essays, these sorts of things. How do we balance the great success that he had as an intellectual and the impact, the worldwide impact that he had, with that education that his father subjected him to? Would he have been the same person? Is that what he's balancing this in that essay when he's struggling emotionally in the autobiography with the difficult childhood that he had and the success that he's had? Or, you know, how did that help shape him, and yet really he suffered from it?
Yes. Well, one of the things interesting that anyone who reads the book, the autobiography, will think this was an infant prodigy. This guy was written. This guy's mind was something else. Mill actually says that's not the case at all. Mill actually is very modest. He sort of says, almost says I was a person of average intellect. It was just the education I got which turned me into something. And clearly that education was, really, really quite something. This is the whole point here. He didn't play with other children, didn't have any toys and those sorts of things. He sat in his father's office, read and worked with his father from a very early age and so on. And it clearly produced a formidable mind. There's absolutely no doubt, no doubt about that. But also one of the things that always amazed me about Mill and also about his father, but also about so many other Victorians, of course, is just how hard they worked. You know, remember Mill always had a full-time job, right? He had a full-time job running the British Empire in India. And on the side, he wrote all these things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that work ethic that he had, I guess must have come from somewhere. And it did give him it gave him the basic tools. He remained a utilitarian through and through, right until the end. So, you know, it could not have been otherwise. But it's just that what he then does, he just chooses, having had what you and I would, you know, at our age would call a mental breakdown. I imagine, incidentally, that sex had something to do with it. He's not going to put that in there. You know, it's a classic sort of late teenager transition from being a boy to a man, and all the things which come with that. Now, he can't put that in this book. But what he's saying when he's I have no sense of any human feelings and things like that. I mean, see, what do? I can't love anyone. I don't know how to love someone in any way whatsoever. But he takes that with him, and somehow manages to refashion it to make it not destructive, but in actual fact incredibly productive. And I think that's one of the remarkable achievements all this, but there are casualties along the way.
There are trade-offs, as the economists would say.
Yeah, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs along the way.
So,
but,
no, please continue.
No, I just think so. You know, that's what he was. He was this product, an extraordinary product. Somehow or other, he learned to live with it. And I guess you could say, to give him credit, that he tried to use that formidable intellect, that formidable training he'd received, as he saw it, for the good of other people, really, for the good of society more generally. I mean, that's what he tried to do. He was a public servant, a public intellectual, public servant, really, in that sense.
And with his father serving as an example in that regard, and also the work ethic. And I think that work ethic it's a great point that that needs to be emphasized. There was no 8 to 5 during the Victorian era, and the amount of time that he spent and the things that he did as a child were just extraordinary. I mean,
the other thing is, then, not only did they work hard, of course, the other thing, but read anything about the Victorian age, they were also ill most of the time as well. You know, Mill was ill for a lot of the time. You know, he went to Italy, I think, or Switzerland, because he had some problem with his head, permanent headaches and things like that.
Well, miasma theory was still the dominant medical theory at the time, right? So I wanted to turn next to the claim that he makes in the autobiography about Turgot. Forgive me. So this is in chapter 4 of the autobiography, and he's discussing, that he did not have a lot of familiarity with poetry, which for him might be still a great deal more than most normal people would have. And he's discussing about the texts that influenced him most during these periods, that different period that you addressed. And then he says about some of the books that really animated him. He mentions Plutarch's Lives. We'll talk, and Ruth discussed that, and if you're interested in that topic, I'd recommend our viewers to begin with Ruth's interview or her essay. But then he also mentions Condorcet's Life of Turgot. And he says of this, a book well calculated to rouse the best sort of enthusiasm, since it contains one of the wisest and noblest of lives, delineated by one of the wisest and noblest of men. For our viewers and our readers who might not be as familiar with French political theory as you are, that's just about everybody, you animate and give us some information about the book, but also Turgot's life, and it is a kind of a tragic story concerning the revolution in France and his attempts to instill some form of liberalism. If you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it's interesting with Turgot that amongst economic liberals in France, Turgot remains a great hero. He was a statesman and he was a political economist. It's interesting the take that Mill has on him, of course, because in the autobiography, in a sense, the big conclusion he draws that one shouldn't be sectarian. I mean, that's the big conclusion that he draws from reading that, and he says henceforth, I didn't call myself utilitarian, etc., etc. So that's a big take-home point which Mill makes in the autobiography. When Turgot is interesting, I think that for many of us, I think it was George W. Bush, wasn't it, who said the thing about the French is they don't have words for entrepreneur and things like that. You remember that one? That's to say that we do tend to think, I think all of us tend to think of France. When we think about economics, I mean, France is a deeply statist country. The state has an enormous role in the economy. And if you go right there back to the 17th, 18th century, the state had an enormous role in the economy and so on. And so most of us, sort of innocently, when we think about political economy in France, imagine that it was always statist and so on and so forth. In actual fact, the French political economists probably got to markets before probably anyone else. And it was through people like Turgot and others around that time. And he, with the as I say, other people that he knew and he learned from and so on. I mean, I think can be counted amongst the very first people to understand, when we get to begin to understand the question of how wealth was created. I mean, again, that's something else we tend to forget now. I mean, I ask my students this: how is wealth created? How is it done? How can we say this country is 3% wealthier than it was last year, or 10% wealthier? So how does that happen? What's the mysterious process which allows us to create wealth? And I think that someone like Turgot, his the significance really for the long-term significance of Turgot is that he basically realised there was a distinction between productive and unproductive labour. And unproductive labour, frankly, was basically money spent on luxury, the state, and all the sort of things you could see around him, which was Louis XIV, Louis XVI, the state, which was consuming vast amounts of money. There was a big debate about that, of course, about luxury and so on. But he made that distinction between productive and unproductive labour. Now, it's around that time, of course, they were essentially physiocrats. They thought the source of all labour was really land, but they were getting there. They were getting there. There's this idea that not all labour was the same. Some was productive of wealth and some was wasteful of wealth. And I think that's where Turgot and those around him really fit into the story. And there's something else which, of course, they add, which is absolutely fundamental, is that you and I as individuals are best placed to know what our best interests are. And it's not the government. We know best what our interests are. Now, if you've got those two ideas about what it is that produces wealth and how its individuals are actually best placed to know how to do it and what wealth they want, then you've got two really radical ideas. And of course, on that basis, you can build so much more. So I think that's why people like Turgot was so important. Of course, they largely failed in terms of getting their message across, as did most everyone else around that time. But you can see him, I mean, as a sort of someone who precedes Adam Smith, for example. You think, well, Adam Smith is obviously the great writer on these matters. But, before Smith, it was the French political economists, including Turgot, who were the really, really important figures in this field.
It is kind of a tragic story in that physiocrats did have a lot of the answers to the problems that plagued that regime. And certainly when Turgot was, what was his official position before he was sacked? It was
might have been Comptroller General. I can't remember.
It was.
Comptroller General, yeah. So in other words, he was in charge of all the finances of the state and so on. And a lot of these guys worked for the state. And they worked for the state because they travelled around. And it was in travelling around, they looked at things, hang on, this is not working, this is absolutely ridiculous, this is not how it should work. Why is the state making all these decisions about this? Yeah. But they worked for the state, but in doing that, they realised that this was not how it should be done.
And their goal was to try to reshape it in such a way as to make a transformation that would have been rather than the rather violent revolution.
That's right.
And I think the impact of that revolution, which you document beautifully in your book, Revolution and the Republic, and I would recommend that book to any of my readers who are interested in exploring this topic further. It's an Oxford University Press, 2010, I believe, is it?
Correct.
Yes. And you document all the impacts of the revolution on the evolution of the French state, but their goal was to try something more transitional or more gradual in a transition, and just either didn't have the time or the influence to pull that off. So.
Of course, one other footnote to this, the book we referred to is The Life of Turgot by Condorcet. And of course, Condorcet is executed in the revolution.
He didn't end as well for him.
Yeah.
So I wanted to this actually brings me to let's take us back to Mill a little bit. I wanted to know, because it's very clear in the autobiography that the French Revolution, and Ruth's first essay brings this out, had a huge impact on Mill's thought and the way he viewed the world. Your scholarship during this period focuses more on France, but obviously you have some sense as to what France's impact was globally. Can you describe how powerful that revolution was in the thinking of not only Mill, who was a liberal, but intellectuals generally during that period, and how and also specifically how it impacted Mill and his writing and his thoughts for our viewers?
Well, I think as soon as the French Revolution got underway, I mean, everyone, not just in France, but in Europe and beyond to America, saw that this was something the like of which had not occurred before, and they were right. I mean, and when we read Edmund Burke, most people think that Edmund Burke wrote that book later than he did. He wrote it very early on, before the Terror, etc. Yes. Burke gets it. This is something which means it seeks to change absolutely everything, and that's what the French Revolution did. Remember, it seeks to change the way people dress, the way people spoke, the maps, the coinage, weights and measures, the calendar,
the way they think, even.
Yeah, I mean, the way they thought they'd abolish the Christian religion, give a new religion, and so on and so forth. So I think, so everyone realizes that it was that important. Now, I mean, you're right, in my book, which is essentially History of French Critical Thought, I essentially set that whole book up as to say that you can see French critical thought as a continuous discussion of the French Revolution over a period of 200 years. But it likewise had an enormous impact in Britain, and any educated person in Britain, including John Stuart Mill, would have had to have had, you know, a line on the French Revolution. And in fact, I've just been reading, because I'm writing a book on Alexis de Tocqueville at the moment. And towards the end of his life in 1857, Tocqueville came to London to work in the British Library, the British Museum Library. And the reason he came there was, believe it or not, was because the British Library had the largest single collection of pamphlets from the French Revolution of any library in the world. It was in Britain, so there have been 14,000, I think he says there were something like 14,000 pamphlets the British Library had on the French Revolution. Now he says they were difficult to read because they're not catalogued correctly and so on. I mean, that tells you something about what was going on. There was all this, and also they've got one of the great conservative politicians in the 19th century Britain was Lord Salisbury as the Prime Minister, and apparently, I've been to Hatfield House where the family still lives. I've not actually managed to check this out, but apparently the library, you know, Salisbury's library in Hatfield House was absolutely full of books on the French Revolution. And of course, one of the things it taught Salisbury was politics is all about class struggle. And that's what he got out of it. That's what I got out of the French Revolution. And I think Mill was one of those people who saw the importance of the French Revolution, and saw that it fundamentally changed and shifted our perspective on the world. For good, and I'm not so certain. I mean, I need to look more closely, but I think most people thought. Well, some people thought it was just for ill, but I think most people thought it was for good and ill.
So this brings us to the last question I'd like to ask you, and that is about your last comment. So you mentioned Salisbury on the one hand, who's a conservative, during his career facing the wave of pressure for expansion of the franchise in England, and is torn by it. And then you've got someone like Mill, who's much more radical in his view on representative government participation, including women in the process. So how do we think then? How do we think that Mill processed this rather transitional period in Europe and in England, Britain more generally, and used the French Revolution and used the examples of people like Turgot and other people to try to make the process more productive, more constructive, and not as potentially explosive?
Well, I think the answer there is, I mean, in that, in one of Mill's essays, The Spirit of the Age, which is written in the early 1830s, and it is that what you get there is that this age is an age of great transformation, of an age of great change, politically, economically, socially, culturally, and so on, and that we've entered that period of change. Notice it's interesting, lots of other people he cites in the autobiography that he read. He turns to a lot of French writers. He turns to Saint-Simon. He turns to Comte, both of whom absolutely preoccupied by that idea that we'd entered an age transition, and that was a dangerous thing to be. Notice also Mill did not like uncertainty. Right? He does not like uncertainty. So this is an age of transition is a dangerous thing to be. So somehow or other, we've got to find, in a sense, something to replace those old certainties. Now, that's why I think his original attraction to Auguste Comte with the religion of humanity, and he becomes to realize that itself was potentially despotic and so on. But I think that, in a sense, is part of the great Millian project is to see us through that age of transition, that age of uncertainty, to get us the other side, and give us, in a sense, a body of doctrines upon which we'll be able to protect liberty and so on and so forth. So it's that, I think that's I think for him and for so many others, that is seen as a big challenge. We're the famous Matthew Arnold poem, Dover Beach, about, the tide of faith which is receding. It's that idea. So what's going to replace it? And effectively, Mill gives us a sort of rehashed utilitarianism as a way of trying to do it. Now, whether that's adequate or not, it's not for me to say, but that essentially is what he does. So I think that's the big challenge.
So I think in these highly uncertain times of transition, you've left us on a note that makes the essays and the forum even more relevant for our readers and our viewers here. So with that, I'm going to thank Jeremy Jennings for his time and his very thoughtful answers to these questions. Jeremy, thank you very much from Liberty Fund and from the Online Library of Liberty.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and a great privilege. Best wishes to everyone at Liberty Fund.